Picture this. It's near the end of World War II, and a group of German women have just arrived at a prisoner of war camp somewhere in the American heartland. They step off the transport trucks exhausted, confused, and terrified of what comes next. These aren't hardened soldiers. Most of them served in auxiliary roles back in Europe, working communications, nursing wounded troops, or pushing papers in military offices. They never expected to end up here, thousands of miles from home, standing in the cold morning air of a country they'd been taught to fear. Everything they knew about America came from wartime propaganda. They'd heard stories of cruelty, of starvation rations, of prisoners treated worse than animals. So when the guards led them toward the mess hall that first morning, their hearts were pounding. Some of them held hands. Others kept their eyes down, bracing for whatever horror awaited them inside. But then something strange happened. The door swung open, and instead of darkness and despair, they were hit with warmth. The smell of fresh baking filled the air. Bright lights illuminated rows of tables where American soldiers sat laughing, talking, eating like it was just another ordinary day. The German women froze in the doorway. This wasn't what they expected at all. They saw trays piled high with food, steam rising from metal serving pans, cooks moving efficiently behind the line with easy smiles on their faces. It looked less like a prison and more like a restaurant. The women exchanged nervous glances, whispering to each other in hushed German. Was this real? Was it some kind of trap? Maybe the Americans were fattening them up before something terrible happened. Or maybe this was just for show, and tomorrow the real punishment would begin. They didn't know what to think. All they knew was that they were starving, and the smell of that food was almost unbearable. Back home in Germany, the final years of the war had been brutal. Food shortages were everywhere. Ration cards controlled every meal. Bread was often stale or mixed with sawdust to stretch supplies. Meat was a luxury most people hadn't tasted in months. Butter, eggs, milk, these things became memories. And here, in this American camp, the breakfast spread looked like something out of a dream. But they were too scared to take it. They stood there awkwardly, not sure if they were allowed to eat, not sure if they should even ask. Minutes passed. The American soldiers finished their meals and filed out, leaving behind trays still half full of food. The cooks began clearing tables, scraping leftovers into bins. One of the German women, probably the bravest or maybe just the hungriest, finally stepped forward. She approached a young American guard standing near the door. Her English was broken, her voice barely above a whisper. She asked if perhaps, maybe, they could have the leftovers. Just the scraps. Whatever was left. They didn't want to be a burden. The guard looked at her for a moment, confused by the question. Then he smiled, a genuine friendly smile that caught her completely off guard. He called over to one of the cooks and said something the women couldn't quite hear. The cook laughed and nodded. The guard turned back to the women and said, "Sure, come on. You'll like this." Within moments, the cooks were preparing fresh plates, not leftovers, but full servings, hot from the kitchen. The German women watched in disbelief as plate after plate was set in front of them. Scrambled eggs, fluffy and golden. Crispy strips of bacon. Steaming oatmeal with brown sugar. Strong black coffee that smelled rich and earthy. And then came something they'd never seen before in their entire lives. Soft, pillowy biscuits, split open and smothered in a thick white sauce speckled with black pepper and chunks of crumbled sausage. The women stared at it. They had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. In Germany, breakfast meant dark rye bread, maybe a little butter if you were lucky, sometimes cold cuts or cheese. This American breakfast was a mystery. The white sauce looked strange, almost like paste or diluted cream. It didn't look appetizing. It didn't look like food. One of the women leaned over to her friend and whispered, "Is this sweet? Is it dessert?" Another woman poked at the biscuit with her fork, watching the gravy ooze around it. She'd never seen bread so soft, so white, so unlike the dense, crusty loaves she grew up with. And that sauce, what was it made of? It smelled savory, meaty even, but the appearance was so unfamiliar that she couldn't bring herself to taste it right away. A few of the braver women took small, cautious bites, and then everything changed. Their eyes widened. Surprise registered on their faces. They took another bite, bigger this time, and another. Within minutes, every single plate was scraped clean. The rich sausage gravy, peppery and warm, coating the tender biscuits. It was unlike anything they'd ever tasted. Heavy, yes. Rich, absolutely, but also comforting in a way they couldn't quite explain. It filled them up, warmed them from the inside, made them feel, for just a moment, like maybe everything would be okay. One of the cooks, an older man with kind eyes, noticed how quickly the food disappeared. He walked over with a ladle and a pan, asking in simple English if they wanted more. The women looked at each other in shock. More? They could have more? Hesitantly, one of them nodded. The cook smiled and spooned generous second helpings onto their plates. They ate again, slower this time, savoring each bite. Some of them even asked for thirds. By the time breakfast was over, the German women sat back in their chairs, fuller than they'd been in years, processing what had just happened. This wasn't the America they'd been warned about. These weren't the cruel captors they'd been told to expect. These were people who smiled, who joked, who offered extra helpings without being asked. And that strange dish, those biscuits with gravy that looked so unappetizing at first, had become the most memorable meal of their entire captivity. Over the following weeks and months, biscuits and gravy became something the women actually looked forward to. It was served regularly, sometimes with scrambled eggs, sometimes alongside fried potatoes. The cooks learned which women liked extra gravy, which ones preferred their biscuits less soggy. Small conversations started happening across the language barrier. A guard would ask, "Good," and the women would nod enthusiastically, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. Food, it turned out, was more than just sustenance. It was communication. It was kindness. It was a bridge between two groups of people who were supposed to be enemies, but who, in that moment, were just human beings sharing a meal. Years later, after the war ended and these women returned to Germany, many of them would tell this story to their families. They'd describe the confusion, the fear, the unexpected generosity. They'd laugh about how strange American food seemed at first, and how they came to crave it. Some of them even tried to recreate biscuits and gravy in their own kitchens back home, though it never tasted quite the same. The ingredients were different, the technique was off, and besides, it wasn't just about the food. It was about the moment, the context, the surprising kindness that came when they least expected it. This story isn't unique to these women. Throughout World War II, hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war passed through American camps, and their experiences were remarkably similar. The United States, partly because it was geographically removed from the fighting and partly because of deliberate policy decisions, treated POWs relatively well compared to many other nations. The Geneva Convention set certain standards, and America generally followed them. Prisoners were fed adequately, housed in decent conditions, and treated with a level of respect that many of them found shocking. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There were incidents, injustices, and hardships. But on the whole, German POWs in America often ate better than German civilians back home. They worked on farms, in factories, sometimes even in local businesses, earning small wages and interacting with American communities. Many of them formed friendships with the guards, with the farmers they worked for, with the townspeople they encountered. When the war ended and it came time to send them home, some didn't want to leave. They'd found a strange kind of peace in captivity, a glimpse of a different way of life. But back to that breakfast, back to those biscuits and gravy. Why did this dish, of all things, become so memorable? Part of it was the sheer contrast. These women came from a place of scarcity, where every calorie was precious, where meals were bland and monotonous. Suddenly they were eating food that was rich, flavorful, abundant. It was sensory overload in the best possible way. Part of it was the psychological impact. They'd been conditioned to expect cruelty, and instead they received generosity. That disconnect, that shattering of expectations, left a lasting impression. And part of it was simply that biscuits and gravy is comfort food in its purest form. It's warm, it's filling, it's unpretentious. It doesn't try to be fancy or sophisticated. It's just honest, straightforward, satisfying food. For people who were tired, scared, and far from home, that kind of comfort meant everything. In the broader context of World War II history, stories like this are often overlooked. We focus on the battles, the strategies, the big political decisions. We study D-Day and the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. And those things are critically important. They shape the world we live in today. But history is also made up of millions of smaller moments, individual human interactions that reveal character and values. The decision to feed prisoners well, to offer seconds, to smile and joke with people who were technically enemies. These weren't grand strategic moves. They were small acts of decency carried out by ordinary people, cooks and guards and camp administrators who chose kindness over cruelty. And those small acts mattered. They mattered to the German women who received them. They mattered in shaping post-war attitudes and relationships. They mattered as examples of how we can choose to treat each other, even in the worst circumstances. Today, when we think about World War II, it's easy to view it in black and white terms, good guys versus bad guys, allies versus Axis. And there's truth to that framework. The Nazi regime was evil, the war was necessary, and the Allied victory was crucial for human freedom and dignity. But within that larger framework, there were countless moments of nuance, complexity, and shared humanity. Not every German was a Nazi fanatic. Not every prisoner was a hardened warrior. Many were just people caught up in events beyond their control, doing their best to survive. The women in this story didn't choose to go to war. They didn't choose the ideology that dragged their country into global conflict. They were products of their time and place, shaped by propaganda and circumstances, trying to navigate an impossible situation. And when they found themselves in an American POW camp, far from home and uncertain of their fate, a simple breakfast became a turning point. It wasn't just food. It was a message. It said, "We see you as human beings. We're not going to starve you. We're not going to punish you unnecessarily. We're going to feed you, treat you decently, and show you that there's another way." Did it change their politics overnight? Probably not. Did it make them question everything they'd been told? Maybe. At the very least, it planted a seed of doubt about the propaganda they'd consumed for years. If Americans were supposed to be monsters, why were they offering extra helpings of biscuits and gravy? If this was supposed to be a punishment, why did it feel more like hospitality? These questions didn't have easy answers, and perhaps that was the point. Complexity is uncomfortable. It's easier to maintain clear categories, us versus them, good versus evil. But reality is messier than that. Reality is a camp cook noticing that the new prisoners are hungry and deciding to give them a little extra. Reality is a guard making a joke to put nervous women at ease. Reality is a group of former enemies sharing a meal and discovering that they're not so different after all. The legacy of this story extends beyond World War II. It speaks to how we treat people during conflicts today, how we balance security concerns with human dignity, how we maintain our values even when dealing with those who may have opposed us. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences beyond the immediate moment, that small kindnesses can echo through decades, that food and hospitality have power we often underestimate. So the next time you sit down to a plate of biscuits and gravy, remember this story. Remember the German women who encountered it for the first time in an American POW camp, who went from suspicion to surprise to satisfaction. Remember the cooks who prepared it and the guards who served it with a smile. Remember that even in the darkest chapters of human history, there are bright spots, moments of grace that remind us what we're capable of when we choose compassion over cruelty. This is a true story from World War II, one of millions that together paint a fuller picture of what that conflict was really like. It's not the headline story, it won't make it into most history textbooks, and you probably won't see a movie made about it. But it's real, it mattered to the people who lived it, and it has something important to teach us about empathy, generosity, and the small ways we can make a difference in each other's lives. History isn't just about the big moments. It's also about breakfast in a POW camp, about a strange dish that confused and then comforted a group of frightened women, about choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier. And sometimes, that's the most important history of all.